Welcome to the Season 1 compilation of Creepify True or False, the original animated web series where I put together bizarre stories with creepy illustrations. I'm going to go through all of this year's episodes and then I will tell you which really happened at the end. Back in the early 90s, a male friend, Scott, invited my girlfriend and I to Sandy Pond Beach to go boating with him and his friends. He was already camped there, so gave us instructions that once we got there, we should check in with Nick, the marina owner, and ask him to boat us over to his nearby site. We drove up that afternoon, but once we got to the marina, found that Nick wasn't there. While waiting for him to return, we happened upon a charming young guy having breakfast in the marina restaurant and started chatting with him. I've forgotten his name, so I'll call him Bob. When we explained we were waiting for a ride to the beach, Bob readily offered to take us there. It was just a short jaunt, so we agreed and proceeded to follow him down to the dock, jumped into his snazzy new boat. My friend eyed a handgun lying in the hold up front and remarked that the holster looked just like the one on her brother's sheriff department service revolver. Bob related the fact that he was a Pennsylvania police officer, flashed us his badge. He told us he was off duty for the weekend and was there to spend the weekend at his aunt's camp. He then suggested that we swing over to his camp to pick up some river tube so we could all go tubing once we met up with our friends. Sure, sounds like fun. We arrived at his aunt's very picturesque camp and waited in the boat while he loaded the tubes on the back, then took off to meet Scott and the gang. Shortly found them and joined their bevy of boats queued up along the beach. Introduced Bob all around and everybody seemed to enjoy his company. They liked him even more when he was preparing to leave and told us we could keep the 2 river tubes. A gift, he said. They were spares and he didn't need them. We all thought his generosity a bit odd, but off he drove, leaving the tubes. We spent a couple more hours tubing, then boated back to the marina, to our car, and started driving home. Naturally, we had the car radio playing as we chattered about what a fun day it had been. Suddenly, our music was interrupted by a local news bulletin notifying us that an APB was being put out for a suspected cop killer. The reporter stated that the day prior, a Pennsylvania police officer had pulled over and was in the process of apprehending a suspect driving a stolen SUV. The officer was later found on the side of the road, shot dead with his own service revolver. The suspect reportedly then traveled to Sandy Pond Beach, where he holed up in a camp overnight. The camp's owner was away at the time of the incident, but upon his return, phoned the police to report that his camp had been burglarized and the boat left in disarray. The news bulletin continued, Sandy Pond police officers have just spotted the stolen SUV and are currently in pursuit. Local residents should be on alert because suspect is considered armed and dangerous. I live in the northeastern part of Texas. If you know anything about the Lone Star State, it's that we get some of the craziest weather in the country. Tornadoes, heat waves, Arctic blasts, hurricanes, snow, you name it, we've got it. Some time ago, we were in the midst of an epic string of storms. Some monster supercells developed and made their way over to my neck of the woods. I was home alone with my cat that night. Now, I'm not afraid of storms, but if you've ever been through a serious weather event, you know that it's something to be taken seriously. Henry the cat was sleeping peacefully in his giant cat bed while I tried to find something interesting on the TV to no avail. All of a sudden, Henry jumped out of his bed and onto my bed. I thought maybe he was spooked by some crashing thunder, which is actually weird in his case. He's literally slept through a hurricane that blew a giant bench into my door, so I tried to tell him it was okay and placate him. His cries grew louder and more worrisome. I love my cat with all my heart. I felt terrible to see him getting so stressed. Suddenly, like a bat out of hell, Henry leapt up and darted out of my room. He's never done this before, so I followed closely behind him. Then I heard it. I thought it was a gunshot or a crash of thunder by close-by lightning. The bang was that loud. I made it back to my room where I saw a hole in my ceiling. Rain was pouring through, and on my pillow, right where I was just seconds before, a massive hailstone now laid. It was larger than my hand, and it was heavy. Henry now trotted back into my room like everything was fine and rubbed up against my leg. I gave him extra treats that night. I was driving a moving truck and had driven my route before and really knew it. Strangely took an exit I didn't need, and this was in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, so the exits weren't like all over the place, or the road wasn't confusing, and ended up having to drive through some stupid rinky-dink town. But there was a tornado that dug up some of the interstate I should have been on that I missed. Hello, my name's Bryce. My brother Miles was my hero. I was too stubborn to say it 10 years ago, but I have no problem admitting it now. He was only 3 years older than me, but you know how it is. When you're 13, the 16-year-olds are the cool kids. Everyone liked Miles. He was a magnet for accolades, and boy was he smart. My parents left us home one night so they could see the gray. They used to have date nights on the first Friday of the month. Miles and I were watching Netflix downstairs in the living room. He went upstairs to get something from his bedroom, and I checked my phone while I waited for him to get back. You know how people say they get a terrible feeling or a sense of dread when something bad is about to happen? Well, I didn't. Not at first. Maybe I'm out of touch, but I was just glad it was Friday and content that I'd finished all my weekend homework early. I was checking my phone when I heard my brother yelling for me outside from the woods. My mind couldn't comprehend how he'd gotten out there so quickly from upstairs, but I instinctually ran out to try to find him. When I opened the door and looked outside, that's when something told me not to go. I don't know if there was something out there or it was just a hunch, but I couldn't go any further. Then Miles surprised me from behind. He'd never left the house at all and said he didn't hear anything. I tried explaining that I heard him from outside, but he said it was probably just the TV or something. We went back to watching television, although I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. We went to bed a few hours later, and I passed out in bed while playing on my phone. All of a sudden, a scream woke me up from my sleep. It was my brother again. I rushed to his bedroom to find out that he wasn't in it. He was nowhere inside. I heard him again and realized the screams were coming from outside. My parents hadn't come back yet, so I begrudgingly tried to find him and heard his voice pleading for me from the woods. It sounded like he was getting farther and farther away the more I chased after him. I ran so deep into the forest that the lights from outside my house waned to a faint glow, and I found myself without the bravery to seek him out any longer. I've always hated myself for that. My parents got back about a half an hour later. My dad tried to placate the situation, but my mother fell to pieces. I still remember the way the swarm of police lights from outside turned the whole block red and blue. I was too caught up in my own thoughts to pay attention to what my parents talked to the police about, but I remember they were there for a while. I didn't sleep for days. Like I said, it's been 10 years since my brother went missing, and he never came home. My parents aren't the same, nor am I. I miss Miles every day. This story was told to me by a friend back in the early aughts. My brother Ross and I were in high school at the time. It was in the late 90s. We were watching some TV, probably South Park if my memory serves correct, when there was a knock at the front door. It was one of the neighbor kids. I'll call him Zach. I'd seen him before, but I didn't personally know him. At first sight, I could tell the kid was panicked. We brought Zach in and sat him down on the chair. The poor guy was all but paralyzed with fear, but eventually he told us what happened. He was in his bedroom working on homework when he heard a commotion in the living room where his mother and brother were. When he went to peek in at what was going on, he saw they were being attacked. He knew he couldn't defend himself or his family, so he hid under his bed. Now, this was a time before cell phones were so common. Text messaging was unheard of, and not everyone had a landline in his or her room, so he was powerless to call anyone for help. He just waited until the screaming stopped. When he went out to the living room, the intruder appeared to be gone, but his mother and brother had been killed. He couldn't tell if he was lucky to be alive or cursed to witness such a horrible crime. After he told us the story, he called the police from our house. They never ended up finding the killer, and Zach ended up suffering from some pretty bad emotional problems in school. He ended up in foster care, which I'm sure most people know is a pretty rough system. Now, years later, my brother Ross and I were playing with a Ouija board. This was before all the horror stories about the game had surfaced, so we were a bit more incredulous. We got the scene set the Ouija board up, and started playing. It took a little while, but the planchette started to move around the board. You know how it goes. We both accused each other of being the one who was moving the planchette around the board, and neither would admit it. I now realize that it wasn't actually being moved by either of us. But that wasn't the strangest part. We had a cockatiel back then named Merle. He was a quite cute and talkative bird. Right when we became convinced the Ouija board was actually moving itself, Merle spoke and said, "I killed the kids." When I was a kid in the early 80s, I encountered something that still haunts me to this day. My parents and I moved into a house in Talladega, Alabama when I was 6 or 7. I didn't know this at the time, but when we moved in, my father had found weird markings carved into the floor, various symbols that no one could recognize. In addition to the markings, there were a myriad of burnt handwritten incantations. He didn't think anything of it, and passed it off as random superfluous artifacts. But soon enough, sketchy people would come to the house asking for some woman who I found out was the former owner of the property. The next sign of something odd would be the one morning when my mother's police scanner would start saying,
"It's time to wake up, Mandy,"
in a dark and ominous tone. This is when the new house changed from odd to straight up terrifying. Now, I loved my mother a lot, but she was a very simple person. She thought that somehow her father was talking to me through the scanner. I know, it doesn't make any sense to me either, but when something strange like this happens, the human mind works to make sense of nonsensical happenings. When you see a ghost movie and the characters are trying to explain the mystical happenings, well, this was that part. We'd get phone calls randomly. I would answer it, and it would start off as a little girl's voice asking, "What's your name?" I would say Mandy, and the voice would turn dark and haunting like it did on the police scanner, and say,
"Mandy, that's a pretty name."
Again, my family chalked this up to a prank caller or something of the like. I realized it was definitely not a prank when I was alone. I would be in bed at night, facing the wall, and pieces of the drywall would start to chip away, like someone was on the other side picking at it with a pickaxe. Once the hole was big enough, I would see a gaunt, humanoid figure with hollow eyes and hollow cheekbones. He was very pale with a black goatee. I don't know how else to describe it, but he looked to have robes similar to a nun, like a cloak. If I would pull the blanket over my face, he would rush to pull it back down. His movements were like that of a sped-up cartoon blur, but to see something like that in real life was absolutely terrifying. He would pick me up and carry me down to a tiny closet that held the hot water heater in it. I would black out, and my parents would find me there the next morning. I begged my family not to force me to sleep alone. My mother and father would not relent, but on occasion my mother would read to me. Sometimes I would see this figure behind my mother, but when she would look, the phantom would flee in his fast motion pace, never to be seen by anyone but me. Sometime later, my mother was home alone cleaning the house, and something came behind her and grabbed her by the shoulder, forcefully spinning her around. When she turned, she was only met with empty air, nothing to be seen. That's when my mother finally believed me. We moved out of the house the next day. I never saw the man again, although sometimes, when I close my eyes, he still haunts me, and I can remember the dread. I was very young and living in a town called Oxford. I was at my grandmother's house this particular day, possibly a defense against intruders. Her house was lined with the blue American agave plant beneath her windows. For those who don't know, It's basically an overgrown aloe bush with giant spiky leaves that would hurt like hell to fall into. My grandmother had a bunch of stray cats around her neighborhood. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I have a deep affinity for cats of all kind, and I have since I was a young boy. The cats would procreate, and a byproduct of this would be there would be a bunch of kittens around, which is why I'm so skilled at finding kittens these days. My grandfather used to repair lawnmowers, so he had a bunch of sheds around, small buildings that the kittens would turn into makeshift homes, along with some of the plants around the property. So one day, while I was in the midst of my daily cat searching and I looked in one of those bushes, I saw a pair of deep red glowing eyes watching me. More than could be reflecting the light of the sun, these were like bright stoplights in the dark night. They appeared to be deeper in the bushes than was possible, if that makes any sense. Initially, I thought they were a pair of snake eyes with my little kid brain, because the pupils were the shapes of a snake's eyes, two narrow slits in the burning red. I tried to tell my grandmother what I saw, but she just said I was being stupid and needed to go back outside and play. I didn't know how to make her believe me, so I relented and left. I never told my parents about the strange and terrifying occurrence. Years later, when I came back to Oxford, my parents were talking about weird things that happened to them when they were kids, and my dad was talking about the time that he was at the Ledbetter's house. They lived maybe 2 streets away from my grandmother. He said that he was at the property with a few of his friends, and they all saw a pair of glowing red eyes that looked like a snake's eyes watching them from the bushes. Like I said, I never told anyone else in my family about what I saw. It chilled me to the core to hear someone else describing exactly what I had seen. I never saw those demonic eyes again. I hope I never do. Back in 2009, I began renting part of a small duplex in the northwest region of the United States. When I say small, it was small. I mean, it looked like it was originally a tiny home that somebody put a dividing wall in because they figured they could charge twice the rent for half the space. My half was sparsely adorned, and I never even got the chance to hang pictures. Now, I was working a somewhat decent job, but I was pretty lonely at the time. I had friends, but they were all working or still in college, and most of them still had boyfriends or girlfriends. I found myself home a lot, so I decided to get myself a cat. He was an adorable orange and white cat I named Larry, affectionately nicknamed Lair Bear. I actually still have him to this day. I'm happy to say Larry is still going strong. I'm sure you have heard the cliches before. It started as just a feeling, a weird feeling of being watched. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'm a 6'2" male on the slender side, not a burly dude at all. And I don't really fear walking home at night or anything, but when you're home alone at night and you feel like someone's watching you, it's mad creepy. So I get these feelings and I just tell myself I'm not used to being roommateless. I'd always close the curtains and lock the door to make myself feel better, and at first it did soothe my mind a little. Next, I'd notice Larry the cat always seemed not to look at me, but behind me. He'd stay fixated on something, always to the side of my shoulder. There'd be nothing there. No bug, no movement of a curtain, no passing people outside, nothing. And he seemed scared. I'd try to hold on to him on my lap and comfort him. He's a total lab cat. But he'd struggle to look at the unknown thing behind me. And when he'd sleep, he'd always seem to have nightmares. He'd twitch and make these sad, whiny noises. One time I tried to comfort him while he slept, and he abruptly woke up and violently scratched my neck. I could tell he felt bad about it afterwards, but it was alarming to see my sweet little cat get so distressed. One night I had a dream that I was in bed and I saw a figure standing next to me, watching me sleep. I don't know how to describe the figure exactly, but it just felt wrong. I knew I wasn't safe. I specifically remember that my clock next to the figure said it was 2:59 a.m. Then I woke up and my room looked the same, minus the figure. The clock looked the exact same as it did in my dream, and now it said it was 3 a.m. It was the most lucid dream I'd ever had. I still had the same feeling as I did in my sleeping state. I just felt wrong and felt the most pure and absolute fear I ever had felt. A few days passed and things were relatively normal, or just the new normal that things had become. My cat was still very visibly shaken by some unknown force or invisible being behind my shoulder, and could only attain restless sleep. About 3 weeks later, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. Larry the cat would sit on my toilet and watch me, perplexed by what was to me everyday ordinary human rituals. He then puffed up his tail and ran out of the bathroom like a burst of wind, and I was left alone, struck again by the ominous feeling that had encapsulated me ever since moving into that duplex. I looked back at the mirror and saw the figure from my dreams staring at me from behind my shoulder. Those hollow, evil eyes bore into my soul and inflicted the most pure, horrible dread I ever felt in my life. Larry and I moved out within the next week. I never saw that figure again, but some nights I still have a dream that someone is watching me sleep. Tree climbing had always been one of my favorite things to do when I was little. It didn't matter how tall they were, as long as they were trees, I could climb them. My personal record for reaching the top of a tree was 60 seconds, which probably isn't that impressive, but for me at the time, I was proud of that. I lived with my grandma back then, and I'd always climb this one tree in our front yard, then swing on it for hours. But one nightmarish incident made me stay away from trees from that point on. It should also be noted that, up until this incident, I wasn't superstitious and I didn't believe in paranormal things. I'd also never had anything like this happen to me again, which makes this event stand out even more in my life. It started out like any other day. I went out to the front yard after breakfast, ready to do some climbing as usual. I kicked off my shoes and took off my socks since I was more adept at climbing barefoot. Then I made my way up the tree trunk and grabbed onto the lowest branch I could. Closing my eyes, I decided to just dangle there in the air, enjoying the wind brushing against my face. After 5 minutes, I heard something digging into the tree trunk below me. I looked down, and to my surprise, I saw a bald man with gray skin and a black cloak sitting cross-legged at the base of the tree. At least, it looked like a man. He was etching something into the tree with his sharp nails, but I couldn't see what it was. Since I was a very naive 8-year-old, I didn't think he had any bad intentions, so I had no reason to be alarmed. Instead of calling out for my grandma, I stupidly asked him, "Do you need any help?" while casually dangling from the branch above him. The man looked up at me with his orange eyes and smiled, almost as if he were happy I acknowledged his existence. And to this day I wish I hadn't. His creepy smile grew even wider, revealing a set of razor-sharp teeth. "Why, yes I do, sweetie. I haven't had a bite to eat all day, so why don't you come down here from there before I come up and get you myself," he said in a raspy voice. My face went pale after hearing those words and seeing the guy's monstrous teeth. I was so scared that I just froze up, clinging to the branch a little tighter while my bare feet dangled above his head. Whoever this guy was, he clearly wasn't human. It wasn't until the man stood up and began reaching for my legs with his inhumanly long arms that I snapped out of my daze. I quickly brought my legs up and over the branch, then started climbing for my life. I think I climbed nearly 3 times faster than my usual pace in that one moment. The palms of my hands and the soles of my feet slapped loudly against branch after branch as I moved with a sense of intense, life-threatening urgency. After making it halfway up the tree, I looked down to see if he was still there, but he was gone. Not a single trace was left of him. For a moment I began to question if he was ever there to begin with. Suddenly, 2 large hands grabbed both of my ankles, pulling my feet out from under me and causing me to fall on my back. Before I knew it, I was hoisted into the air, dangling upside down by my feet. I frantically looked up to see the creature's horrifying face smiling down at me. I don't know how it reached the top before I did. I didn't even see it pass me. The thing's movements defied logic. "I win," it said while licking its teeth. "Now for my prize." The creature then opened its mouth inhumanly wide, revealing hundreds of sharp teeth. It then slowly brought my feet up to its open maw, ready to devour me. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I kicked my legs frantically, trying to free myself, but to no avail. I was only saved when my grandma came outside after I screamed. The creature dropped me before disappearing without a trace, almost as if it never existed. I got out of that tree so fast and ran straight into my grandma's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I tried to explain to her what I'd seen, but she didn't believe me. Years have passed since then, and the creature never returned, but I'll never forget that thing's face as long as I live. For reference, I am a male. When I was in high school in the mid-aughts, I was dating a guy named Alex who claimed he could see spirits. I was the incredulous type at this time, although this experience is what shaped me to believe in a world we can't necessarily see. We broke into a courthouse on the East Coast that we believed was haunted. We wanted to check it out because people claimed it was haunted. It had a basement that piqued my interest. My boyfriend grew upset that I wanted to look inside it. Looking back, I was just a teenager who wanted to look cool, but as I said, it caught my attention. Alex said that he felt something evil in that basement, a presence that wanted to cause harm to anyone who intruded. This whole time he said there were bad vibes in this place. He physically dragged me away from the entrance and wouldn't let me look. In the end, we didn't go into that particular entrance. But I think that's when we got the attention of whatever or whoever was inside. We ended up going back into the main courthouse shortly thereafter and making out a little bit. I know it seems weird, but we got caught up in the moment and it felt right. But not too long after, Alex abruptly stopped. He jumped up and looked horrified. Seeing him act so completely afraid rubbed off on me, and I felt a little scared too. If you've ever seen someone struck by terror or felt it yourself, you'll know what I'm talking about. We left that particular room, and I happened upon a spiral staircase that led up to a door. Being ever curious, I took the stairway up and opened the door, and behind it was a brick wall, completely obstructing any sort of exit. That in itself was strange, but when I got back down and looked up, I saw some kind of silhouetted shadow person. I was close enough to be able to discern any features of this specter, yet there were none. It was as if darkness took the shape of a person. Though it looked to have no eyes that could see me, I could tell it was looking in our direction. More specifically, it was looking at me. It was like a weight on top of me, the fear I felt from that dark and simple form. I watched him, or it, turn and open a door behind him and walk inside that door I had just scoped out. So I know this couldn't have been possible. Now I wanted to leave. My boyfriend didn't argue at all. He had seen what I did. When we left the courthouse, I looked up and saw the shadow that stalked us inside, watching us go. I wish I could put into words the fear that gripped me still, and I was left with so many questions. Alex and I broke up a long time ago. A few weeks ago, I ended up chatting with him a little bit. It was the first time we'd spoke since we graduated high school. Being that he was the only one who shared this experience with me and saw the Umbra-like man, I asked him about it.
Yeah, I remember.
He laughed. I didn't understand what was funny about it, but he continued.
It's been following you around since that night.
As of now, Hurricane Ian is responsible for the deaths of at least 147 people, most of which happened in Florida. But there's a victim that was undoubtedly lost in the masses, and who remains nameless, to my knowledge at least. I live in one of the cities that got hit badly by the eye wall of the storm. The entire natural landscape around me is still different, and the tree line and surrounding area has not recovered. One of the hardest parts of the storm was being landlocked without power for over a week after Ian hit. We were flooded on all sides of our home and unable to drive our car out through the massive amount of water that became a moat around our living quarters. But I should back up a little bit first. The last night before the storm hit, it was September 27th, and I wanted to go out for one last walk around my neighborhood. I knew I most likely wasn't going to be able to for a while, and I was right. They had begun construction on a few new houses around the corner from mine, and I'd always noticed this one porta potty that smelled terribly. Of course they all do, but this one was awful. I also heard footsteps around that area whenever I'd walk by the vicinity. I chalked it up to deer and just crossed the road to avoid the stench. A couple of weeks after the storm hit, I was finally able to go walking again. When I made it back to the construction site, the stench was overpowering and it didn't smell like a normal porta potty. I know that sounds comical, but it was getting eerie. The site hadn't been worked on since before the hurricane hit, so, ever ruled by curiosity, I opened the door. There was a man inside. His throat had been cut and he looked like he was there for a while. There were stab marks all over him, and then I heard a rustling in the woods, but it sounded like it was charging for me. Hearing it more clearly, I realized it wasn't deer at all. It sounded more bipedal, so I rushed home to call the police. I'd never been through this before. It changes your perspective on life to realize how quickly it can all end. How you can just manage to live your life, and one day some psycho cuts you up and humiliates you like that. I spoke to the cops, and they said they'd have a look around the scene, and that was that. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and many nights after. I normally have a lot of raccoons and such running around outside my place. If you didn't gather, it's very much a wooded area with houses dispersed throughout, but something sounded different this one particular night. I was unnerved. Then I heard something scraping against my window. I felt paralyzed at first, but I had to look. And when I went outside, there was nothing there. So I got my cell phone flashlight app, and it reflected on something in the grass. There was a knife that was stabbed into the dirt. It's been over a month now, and no one has been caught. I don't go out for walks anymore. Hey man, if you choose to do this story, and for your animation's sake, I am a guy. About a decade ago, I was living in Kansas. It's hard to believe now, but this was so long ago. And it was more of a drawn-out experience as opposed to a one-time event. I lived with a friend and his family in a house that used to be a retirement home many years ago. That family was its own horror story, but more specifically, the place was haunted. I can't confirm or deny this, but my friend's mother said one day she woke up to see a figure looming over her bed, one that swiftly disappeared. She was a woman who quite enjoyed a drink, or 10, but I wouldn't have been surprised at all if there were a peeping Tom ghost that gave her trouble. The occurrence that provoked my belief is the music. I can't even begin to explain how this would happen, but at night we would all hear jazz music that sounded like it was coming from another room. I always felt like I would see people out there grooving around to the jazz if I went out there, but anytime I'd step foot into the space where the songs were coming from, the room would grow silent. Now, I was a lot bolder in that period. I couldn't imagine doing this now, but one day when I was alone, I went down to the basement by myself. This gives me chills now just thinking about it, and I still can't believe my younger self's bravery. But I shut all the lights out and brought a recorder with me, and I thought I would do some EVP. If anyone doesn't know, it stands for Electric Voice Phenomenon. It's basically when you can record ghosts' voices on a device that you wouldn't be able to hear otherwise. So I was down there for a while trying to converse with one of my phantom roommates, and I began to hear what sounded like metal clinking on the concrete floor. I didn't realize it then, but some years later I realized it sounded like a walker moving across the ground. The process was as follows. I would ask a question, wait 10 minutes, not hear anything, and repeat the operation. It's hard to remember, but I'd say I spent at least an hour down there having a one-sided conversation with the air. So I got up, frustrated, and left, feeling defeated and like I got nowhere. But then I went to review the audio and got to the last question I asked. I didn't want to sound disrespectful to the ghosts and blatantly ask how they died. I know sometimes spirits don't always understand that they are dead and stuck lingering on the earth. So I asked, "Can you tell me how you got to where you are?" And I swear to you, clear as day, I heard the whisper of a voice say, "I can't." I even had other people listening to the recording, skeptics and all, and they said they heard it too. I deleted the recording when someone told me ghosts can follow you if you have a photograph or some kind of recording of them. They don't like to be captured in any way, and I didn't know that. I don't need phantoms stalking me now. Some time passed, and I was again home alone in my bedroom. I think I was watching TV or reading a book, just enjoying the night by myself. There was nothing remarkable going on, but then the door slammed shut with a force that felt angry. I was honestly surprised nothing broke. I ran out of the house and waited for someone else to get home. There were no instances where I felt absolutely afraid until that happened. I never stayed home alone again. Be careful meddling with spirits. They too can meddle with you. Hey, I like your channel. I used to have a fairly big one myself. I got 2 of those YouTube plaques and everything. I tell you this story not as a means to instill fear. but as a cautionary tale of what can happen if you end up reaching the wrong people, like I did. This is a fairly long story, but I feel like it's all relevant, so please bear with me. I am a female. I graduated with my undergraduate in 2011 when the economy was still a little bit in shambles. I know you other millennials will know what I'm talking about. I wanted to be an English teacher in a university setting, and I double majored in English and education. I was anxious to get my master's, yet I was dead tired after working part-time and writing more papers than I care to remember, so I moved back in with my parents after school. It was supposed to be temporary, but it lasted a little longer than I expected. I ended up working at a local coffee shop near my parents' house. I honestly didn't mind so much because the customers were so pleasant. Because I began to feel so comfortable and I could sustain myself, I began to push back the plan to continue my education. I was going out with some old high school friends in town the first time I found out I was good with makeup. Brenda, my old bestie, had gotten a job at Sephora and scored a ton of the best top shelf products. I had a lot of time to get ready, so I figured I'd get a little dolled up. I know some of the other girls out there know it's nice to feel pretty. It's amazing what some foundation, an eyebrow pencil, and a good lipstick can do. My friends at the club all said I looked so pretty. I couldn't help but indulge in all the compliments. I'd never really felt ugly per se, but that night I certainly felt beautiful. The makeup felt like a calling for me then and there, and I decided the next day I would commit some time to evolving my skills. After only a couple of months, I felt like I knew enough to teach others. I got a used Canon 5D Mark II, and then worked my way up to a Canon C100. My first YouTube video made it to 100 views in 48 hours. I remember feeling like I made it. I'm sure you know that feeling when you finally start to see progress in an endeavor. After about 6 months, I submitted a request to be monetized and was approved. I was ecstatic. I remember joking with my mom and telling her I found my place in the sun. It felt great to teach other people. Of course, I'd get the occasional rude comment or the creepy ones from scuzzy guys, but I'd block them and move on. It seemed like it was part of my day to delete his comments, but then I just stopped paying attention. A year after starting my channel, I was officially making enough money to quit my job at the coffee shop. I knew it was time to commit myself to teaching makeup. It was so fulfilling to do something I loved. For the first time in my life, I was truly happy. I ended up putting together a very small LLC for my makeup brand. I even got my kitchen certified and manufactured at home. I marketed it on the basis that I was cruelty-free and used no animal products. You'd be surprised to know how common shark liver oil, beeswax, honey, etc. are in everyday beauty products. I was nearing the point where I was apartment hunting and thinking about moving out of state, but still in my parents' place. My mother was a corporate paralegal and helped me make the LLC official. I didn't think twice when she said I could use her address as headquarters for the paperwork. I was just happy that I could start to write off expenses. But I found out the hard way that a simple Google search of my name would result in my family's address. About 5 months after I started my brand, I rented a house that was 2 states away from my family's place. It was so cute and I loved having the chance to decorate. Living alone was the best, but I ended up getting a phone call early one day. Some man who identified himself as a detective told me I should rush back to town and refused to tell me over the phone what had happened, but I had a suspicion. Urgent phone calls like that are never a good thing. I drove 8 hours and met the detective at the precinct. It turned out both my parents were dead. My old stalker got tired of me ignoring his advances, so he showed up to my parents' house looking for me. A singular Google search of my name led him directly to my mom's and dad's house from when I registered my LLC's business address there. It was a grisly scene too. He ambushed them in their sleep, the coward. He brought a knife with him, knowing he was going to hurt or kill that night, and took out my father first and then my mother. I guess he thought killing them was the next best thing to killing me. I couldn't think of a way for a person to hurt me more. It broke me. My mother was my best friend and my dad was my protector. You hear it all the time. Be careful what you put on the internet. I thought I was careful. I never posted my location or even what state I lived in. Still, the worst person in the world found out enough to change my life forever. So be careful out there, anyone who uses any form of social media. You never know who is watching. Now it's time to discover which of these stories were fiction and which really happened. The first story was where a couple of friends who spent the day with a mystery man and discovered he was a cop killer. This story is actually true. The second story was where a cat that saved a young man from a giant hailstone crashing through the ceiling and obliterating his skull. This story was false. The third story was where a woman who took a random exit and narrowly missed colliding with a tornado. This story was true. The fourth story entailed a couple of brothers hanging out on a Friday night and the older brother going missing under disturbing circumstances. Do you think this one happened? Nope, it's false. The fifth story described a brutal murder, and then a parrot claiming to be possessed by the killer of said murder after some kids played with a Ouija board. This is, in fact, true. The sixth story was where a child who moved into a haunted house and had a first-hand experience with a demonic entity. This was a true story. The seventh story recounted a young boy seeing a pair of demonic, glowing red eyes in the bushes at his grandmother's house. This was a true story submitted to me. In our eighth story, a male moved into a duplex and had haunting dreams of a terrifying apparition that materialized beside him one day. That story was fake. The ninth story was where a young girl who encountered a monstrous man who tormented her while she simply tried to climb a tree. This story was true. The 10th story begins with two boyfriends wanting to explore an abandoned courthouse and ends with them seeing a diabolical shadow man watching them back. This was a true story. The 11th story portrayed a man who went for a long-awaited walk around his neighborhood after Hurricane Ian and found a body in a porta-potty, only to be stalked afterward. I made this story up. The 12th story was a ghost story about a man who lived in the Midwest some years ago and recorded a ghost's voice on an EVP. This was a true subscriber story. Finally, the 13th story was about a YouTuber stalked by a maniacal man who killed her family after feeling scorned for her lack of reciprocity. This story didn't actually happen. Thank you for making it to the end of my first YouTube compilation episode. Thank you so much to all of you who have been with me over the last year. I know some of you have watched my animations since last February, which means a lot. And if you've just checked out my channel and subscribed, that means the world too. This is not an easy endeavor and involves more work than I could have imagined, and I'm constantly working to get better and hopefully make a career of this. If you've got a scary story to submit, you can send it to the link in my bio or head over to the Reddit community at reddit.com/r/creepifystories/submit. Thank you guys so much for watching.